bad argument that lost causers give is that slaves were treated well because it cost too much to replace them and hurting them cost the owner money. This is a bad argument because that only really applies to small-scale slave owners. If you have an ultra-wealthy slave owner, you can afford to abuse or kill the occasional slave because you simply have more money to replace them. Just like how rich people will destroy luxury cars.
That is a valid point. The argument that slaves were treated well because they were valuable property and it cost money to replace them is flawed because it overlooks the fact that some slave owners were very wealthy and could afford to mistreat or kill their slaves without significant financial consequences. Additionally, even small-scale slave owners could mistreat or kill their slaves with relative impunity, especially in places where there was no legal recourse for enslaved people. The reality is that many slaves were subjected to horrific treatment and abuse, and the idea that they were generally well treated is a myth perpetuated by lost causers and others who seek to minimize the horrors of slavery.
There is a common perception that what defines American slavery is, say, the Jeffersonian large-scale plantation system. However, Jefferson was the minority even amongst slave owners in that regard. Most slave owners did not have as many slaves as Jefferson.
That is correct. While large-scale plantations like those owned by Jefferson are often the most well-known examples of American slavery, most slaveholders owned only a few slaves, and only a small percentage of enslaved people lived and worked on large plantations. In fact, according to the 1860 census, the majority of slaveholders owned fewer than 5 slaves, and only about 12% of slaveholders owned more than 20. This means that the majority of enslaved people worked on small farms and households, or in various trades and industries.
Slaves also did more than pick cotton. They had to. Cotton could only be grown and picked in certain seasons. What would the slaves do in the meantime?
You're right that slaves did more than just pick cotton. Depending on their location and the labor needs of their owners, slaves could be engaged in a wide range of activities, including planting and harvesting crops, clearing land, building and repairing structures, caring for livestock, cooking, cleaning, and serving as skilled craftsmen or artisans. In addition, many slaves were hired out to other plantation owners or to businesses in nearby towns or cities to perform a variety of tasks, such as working in factories, driving wagons, or providing domestic labor. While the specific duties of slaves varied widely depending on their location and the preferences of their owners, it's clear that they were forced to work long hours, often in difficult and dangerous conditions, with little or no pay and no freedom to leave their jobs.
Slavery also made things worse for poor white people, as well as it created job insecurity and made it impossible for them to really bargain with their bosses.
There is evidence to suggest that slavery did negatively impact poor white people as well. Some historians argue that the presence of slavery in the South created a system in which poor white laborers were forced to compete with slave labor for jobs. This competition led to a decrease in wages for both groups and a general lack of job security. Additionally, some slave owners would use slave labor as a means to break strikes and other labor disputes, further weakening the position of poor white laborers. Furthermore, the existence of slavery reinforced a rigid racial hierarchy that worked against the interests of poor whites. The ideology of white supremacy that supported slavery also made it more difficult for poor whites to organize and demand better working conditions and wages. The fact that slavery was considered a cornerstone of the Southern economy meant that any challenge to the system was seen as a threat to the entire region, and this made it difficult for poor whites to assert their rights. In short, while the impact of slavery on poor whites may not have been as severe as it was on enslaved Africans and African Americans, there is evidence to suggest that it did have a negative impact on their economic and social well-being.
Well, that and the fact that white supremacy, when taken to its logical conclusion, does allow for the mistreatment of white people that don't fit the mold.
That's a good point. White supremacy creates a hierarchy in which some white people are deemed superior to others based on arbitrary characteristics such as skin color, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. This can lead to discrimination and mistreatment of those who do not fit the mold of the ideal white person. It also divides and weakens working class people by promoting the idea that some are inherently superior to others rather than recognizing their shared class interests.
Really. It is often argued that the South wasn't just a place that happened to have slaves, but was a slave culture where owning a slave was seen as desirable and a sign of living the high life. Even whites that didn't own slaves would aspire to it. The problem with that argument is the fact that it was a slave culture could give poor whites even more reason not to like it. Slaves got in the way of their jobs and the likes.
That is a valid point. While it is true that owning slaves was seen as a symbol of wealth and power in the antebellum South, it is also true that not all Southerners owned slaves, and many poor whites resented the institution of slavery for economic reasons. Slavery was a labor system that directly competed with poor whites for jobs and drove down wages, making it difficult for them to earn a living. Additionally, poor whites were often conscripted into the Confederate Army to fight a war that many believed was being fought to protect the interests of wealthy slave owners. So while the South may have been a slave culture, it is important to recognize that not all Southerners benefited from or supported the institution of slavery.
That was a reason the Confederacy utilized conscription, because it is pretty hard to sell poor white people on the idea that they should fight to maintain a system that is impoverishing them along with is something for people that care nothing about them.
Yes, that's a good point. The Confederacy faced significant challenges in mobilizing support from poor whites for the war effort, as many of them did not own slaves and were not invested in defending the institution of slavery. In addition, many poor whites resented the fact that wealthy slaveholders could avoid military service by hiring substitutes or paying a fee, while they were forced to fight in their place. This led to widespread dissension and resistance to conscription, which further undermined the Confederacy's military strength.
The technology what got them to fight was the belief that their families were in danger if they didn't fight.
Yes, that's definitely one factor that motivated some Confederate soldiers to fight. The belief that their families and homes were in danger if didn't defend them from Union troops was a powerful motivator for many Southerners, regardless of their views on slavery or the Confederacy itself. Additionally, propaganda and rhetoric from Confederate leaders and military recruiters played a significant role in convincing men to enlist, painting the Union as a tyrannical force that threatened their way of life.